Welcome to this edition of IBFD's Tax Takes News and Views, bringing you the week's tax news in a nutshell. I'm Barry Larking, Special Counsel at the IBFD, and with me for our Beyond the News interview is Stuart Gibson, IBFD's Chief Editor, Global News in Washington, D.C. On today's show, the OECD's Secretary-General has warned that leadership and political support are needed if the two global tax reform pillars are to succeed. The UK will repeal certain withholding tax benefits for EU residents starting this June, and Uruguay clarifies the costs of becoming a tax resident. These and more, including Stuart Gibson's Beyond the News interview with Grace Perez-Navarro, coming up on IBFD's Tax Takes. First, we turn to the top news of the past week as reported in our IBFD's Tax News Service. In his report to the G20, the OECD Secretary-General was cautiously optimistic about the prospects for reaching consensus later this year on the two global tax reform pillars. Notwithstanding that optimism, he emphasised that strong leadership and unequivocal political support would be needed. More on the two pillars in Stuart Gibson's interview coming up after the news. The Secretary-General's report also highlighted three other OECD work streams we can expect to hear more on in the near future, one on crypto assets and two more on online platforms. Talking of crypto assets, the European Commission has just launched a public consultation on proposals to extend the EU's current reporting and information exchange framework to include crypto assets and e-money. The new rules aim to clamp down on tax fraud and evasion in this space and are scheduled for adoption in the third quarter of this year. The consultation closes on the 2nd of June. In a parallel consultation, the European Commission is looking at ways to improve the relationship between taxpayers and tax administrations, particularly in the area of tax compliance. Key elements of the plans include simplifying tax procedures through the use of digital technology and making those procedures more transparent. The initiative is expected to produce a win-win for both taxpayers and tax administrations. Meanwhile, the European Commission is working to develop comprehensive plans for business tax reform that would address key issues such as post-COVID recovery, population ageing, the globalization and digitalization of the economy, and climate change. The plans are due out before the summer. Sometimes major tax reforms are needed to raise government revenue, and other times it's a question of making minor adjustments along the way. This week, Russia illustrated the latter principle when it proposed to extend for another 3 years its limitation on loss carry-forwards. Meanwhile, Brazil's Supreme Court expanded the tax base for its optional social contributions levy. And last month, Israel's tax authority announced that the agency was considering requiring certain R&D centres to use the profit split method, rather than the traditional and perhaps cheaper cost-plus method. The United Kingdom continues its post-Brexit work on reconstructing its trade network, while at the same time severing its remaining ties with the EU. This week it was the turn of Cameroon, admittedly perhaps not the UK's most important trading partner, to sign an economic partnership agreement. And in its budget statement, the UK government announced the repeal of EU-inspired legislation that permitted gross payments of annual interest and royalties to related companies in the EU. As from June, those payments will be subject to UK withholding tax unless a tax treaty provides otherwise. Most countries determine an individual's tax residence based on where they live or on other similar factors. Other countries, however, adopt a more opportunistic approach and offer tax residence in exchange for economic investment, so-called golden passports. Uruguay falls into the latter category, allowing foreign individuals to obtain tax residence if they make certain real estate and job-creating investments in the country. A recent ruling from the tax administration clarifies how the rules work. One way that Uruguay attracts foreign individuals to take up residence in the first place is, like some other countries, by offering them non-resident status for their foreign passive income. But be warned, as another recent ruling shows, once you've opted in for that status, you can't simply opt back out if you decide you'd be better off being taxed like a normal resident. And now moving on to other news. There are continuing signs that US trade relations with the EU are normalising, with the announcement of a 4-month suspension of trade tariffs that both sides imposed in connection with disputed aircraft manufacturing subsidies. That may indicate a more tolerant approach to digital services taxes going forward. The normative status of the OECD's transfer pricing guidelines, like its model tax convention, is not always accepted by taxpayers or by tax administrations, in particular in countries like South Africa that are not even members of the organisation. A South African tax court recently disposed of such arguments by concluding that countries, presumably including South Africa, have to align themselves with the OECD's transfer pricing guidelines to overcome the challenges brought about by base erosion and profit shifting. And finally, since the attacks of 9/11, we've become used to the United States refusing entry to certain foreigners. But until recently, the reverse was not usually true. A law enacted in 2015 requires the US to revoke the passports of so-called seriously delinquent taxpayers, that is, people who owe more than $50,000 in taxes. Recently, a taxpayer who owed more than $400,000 challenged that law, arguing that it violated his constitutional right to travel. A district court in Georgia, however, disagreed. While the court acknowledged that Americans have a constitutional right to travel within the United States, they have no such right when it comes to leaving the country. Now we go beyond the news for Stuart Gibson's interview with Grace Perez-Navarro at the OECD. Stuart.
Thank you, Barry, for your informative news report. I'm Stuart Gibson, Chief Editor of Global News here at IBFD. I'm joined today by Grace Perez-Navarro, Deputy Director of the Center for Tax Policy and Administration at the OECD in Paris. Welcome, Grace.
Hi, Stu. Great to be here.
Good to see you. Grace, many of our viewers are following developments at the OECD very closely. In particular, they're focused on the goal for the members of the BEPS Inclusive Framework to reach consensus on addressing the tax challenges presented by the digitalization of the economy, BEPS Action 1. Pascal Saint-Amand told a global audience during the OECD's latest Tax Talk session that the stars are aligned for consensus and that he hopes to be able to announce an agreement at the G20 finance ministers meeting in early July. Now, on top of that, the OECD also announced that there would be no more public consultations on the matter. So these raise a number of questions. First, it would appear that the big unsettled issues relate mostly to Pillar 1 and sit more on the political side and less on the technical side. So what are the biggest sticking points right now?
Well, there are both political and technical issues pending for both pillars, although it is true that there are some bigger issues, I would say, on Pillar 1. In terms of the political decisions that still have to be taken, the big one is an overall scope decision, meaning are we going to agree on the scope that is in the pillar blueprint, ADS CFB? Is it going to be broader, narrower, different? And you may remember that the US, the previous administration, had proposed a safe harbor so companies could elect in, which essentially meant there was no scope. It was just whoever wants to be taxed under this. And we're pleased to see that Secretary Yellen has taken this off the table. And so that still leaves the question, what does the new administration want? And what does everybody else want in this space? Just as a reminder to everybody, the vast majority of the 139 members of the Inclusive Framework want to focus on digital. And it was the broader scope that was brought by the Trump administration that led us to the ADS CFB scope. So that is going to be, I think, a fundamental political decision that we hope to get some more information on soon. Then there are other issues like setting the global revenue threshold and other quantitative filters for deciding which companies are in or out. Then we have also decisions on plus factors to determine nexus for CFB, assuming that we're still including CFB. Then there's setting the nexus revenue threshold, decisions on the profit allocation formula, and then importantly, decision on unilateral measures. Are we, how are we going to structure a standstill and a rollback? What is going to be included in this? So we will need to develop criteria to scope the commitment to roll back or stand still. And then at the technical level, we have issues around the revenue sourcing rules, hierarchy, the and trying to find a balance between accuracy and flexibility and also simplicity. One of the big things you may have seen that came out of the public consultation was, please make all of this simpler. And so that is, obviously one of the things we're working on. Then in terms of the tax base, we need to think about the segmentation issues and how we're going to address those, how we're going to deal with B2B cloud software and third-party distributors. So there are quite a few issues. Also on profit allocation, we had this marketing and distribution safe harbor. How are we going to develop that and include mechanisms to prevent duplication with withholding taxes? Because of course we want to eliminate double taxation, and we're going to have to see how we do that. Then on Pillar 2, we also have issues both on the political and technical side. Although we would say that a large number of the elements of Pillar 2 remain pretty stable. But we do have some big issues there, like the minimum rate. What is it going to be? I think before Biden was elected, I could have given you a pretty good guess on what that rate would be. But Biden had as one of his campaign proposals the idea of raising the GILTI rate. So that may affect, what our minimum rate ultimately ends up being. Then there are scope issues here as well, like how to treat international shipping. There are carry forward issues. We still have the design of the carve out and relevant percentages for that to address. Then on the subject to tax rule, we have, again, the minimum rate, the scope of covered payments, what the status of this rule is going to be. Then we have implementation issues. So GILTI coexistence, that was and still remains an issue, how we're going to deal with that. And then how are we going to implement all of this so that it is done in a consistent way? And so we need to still look at the need for and how a multilateral convention might work. So still a lot of issues to resolve and not a lot of time, but a tremendous amount of goodwill and hard work still underway.
Wow, that's a mouthful. I think you need to take a deep breath there, Grace, because the next questions that I have really relate to because we're not in the public consultation phase anymore. It's almost like being in a black box at this point for the outside observers. And so what are you all doing to get everybody together to try to tackle this very long list of issues that, and by the way, I should note that not all of them have the same level of separation in terms of the distance between various interests. So some of them, the members may be much closer together than on others. So what are you all doing at the OECD to help the parties, help the members of the inclusive framework bridge these divides?
Well, you're absolutely right that there are different levels of gaps among countries on different issues. The big issue is really on Pillar 1 in the scope. Once we have a clear idea of what that is, then a lot of the other issues kind of follow from that. So what have we been doing? Well, we have been working very hard at the secretariat level in looking at, since we published the blueprints, since we had the public consultation in mid-January, we're looking to see what different scenarios might come up and how to address those. So if the scope is broad, what do we do? If it's narrow, what do we do? Those things. And then, of course, we have the massive amounts of input from the public consultation, thousands of pages of comments. And so we've been working through those at the secretariat level, but also through the technical working parties that deal with tax treaties, transfer pricing, Working Party 11 on Pillar 2. So they are going through these. And as I said before, we're looking very hard to see how to simplify a lot of this because it is very complex. We recognize that. And so we have been working on that. And we, to some extent, on some of the political issues, as I said before, we are waiting for the U.S. to tell us where their interests lie in the scope issue. And we've already seen, safe harbor come off the table. So that was very useful. I think that sent a very positive signal to other countries. And so we need to wait basically for the scope decision. But in the meantime, there are many other issues, as I just mentioned, that we can continue to work on and discuss with different countries what might be a workable solution.
So I guess that brings me to the question that everybody must be asking these days, which is how realistic is it to expect that all of these issues are going to be addressed and resolved by the beginning of July?
Well, I know it may seem like a daunting task, but here what is important is to have political agreement on the core elements of the package. And that I do think is achievable by July. If we don't reach an agreement on those core elements at that point, then what you will see is the EU will do its own thing. They've been very clear about that. Other countries that have been waiting before putting in a digital services tax or some other tax to deal with this issue will go ahead. And so we will have that chaos. So, there is a lot to do, but I think countries have indicated that they are willing to do the work necessary to try to come to a political agreement. So I would say it is achievable.
So this kind of this explanation, and I really appreciate your laying out not just the challenges, but what the expectations are. And I'm going to use a French analogy here, which is, it sounds to me like the goal is to not have the souffle fully baked by the beginning of July, but to have the bakers agree on the recipe.
Oh, geez, I haven't heard that one.
Popped into my head, Grace.
Yeah. I think it's a little bit more than that. I think it's more than that because we already do have very detailed blueprints, 500 pages of technical detail. And so I think it would be more than that, but there will be further work to be done, that's for sure. We have not and will not have developed a multilateral convention by July, that is clear. But will we have some model legislation for, say, Pillar 2? Yes, probably. So I think the key is to get those core elements agreed and the things that flow from those, recognizing there will be sub-technical issues that will still have to be ironed out.
Maybe we could say the souffle will be in the oven by July.
Yeah, I think it's, if you want to have a French cooking analogy, yesterday I made boeuf bourguignon for the first time, and it takes a long time.
Yes, it does.
And I can tell you, you have to put this whole pot into the oven for 2 hours, and then the last hour you put in the potatoes and carrots. Well, I would say we've got we hope to have the pot in the oven without the potatoes and carrots. So we'll still have that last hour to go.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. I wanted to close because the world is watching, as you know, and so what are the things that we should be looking for between now and the summer, key milestones, let's say, to give us some indication whether, to use Pascal's metaphor, the stars remain aligned?
Well, I think the next key date will be the G20 finance ministers meeting in early April. By then, we should have some more signals, I would think, from the US and be in a better position to talk about that. Then we have the inclusive framework meeting at the end of June. And then the delivery of the agreement is expected for the G20 finance ministers meeting in early July. And I suspect between now and then, we will probably have another tax talks where maybe we can talk a bit more about the progress we're making.
I will be signed up for that, as I have been. So our guest today has been Grace Perez-Navarro, Deputy Director of the Center for Tax Policy and Administration at the OECD in Paris. Thank you so much, Grace, for your time and for sharing your insights on this very complex issue today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Stu.
That wraps up this week's edition of Tax Takes News and Views. The week's tax news in a nutshell from Barry Larking and myself. Thank you for watching. Here's hoping your week is not too taxing.